Have you ever wondered how long a life sentence is? I mean, sometimes you see in TV or on the news, whatever, you see these guys that serve some time and then they were supposed to be convicted of killing someone or something like that, and then they get out and cause all sorts of problems. So, how long is a life sentence? That's what we're talking about today. I'm Eric. This is another episode of From Prison to the Streets. Be sure to like and subscribe. Let's get into this. I served 11 years in prison. I knew a lot of guys who had life sentences. Those were primarily the guys that I hung out with. And so I know a little bit about this subject. We're going to talk about a couple of things. We're going to talk about indeterminate sentences and determinate sentences and the appeals process. We're going to determine exactly how long a life sentence is. Maybe not exactly down to the number, but you'll have an idea of what a life sentence is. But before I get into that, let me just say something right quick. A 5-year sentence can be a life sentence. A 3-year sentence can be a life sentence. 1 or 2 years can be a life sentence. And here's why. Prison is a very real place. It's a place where bad things happen. I've seen people stabbed. I've seen people get beat up. I've seen people get their heads stomped in. A good friend of mine got beat to death in prison. So, you could come into prison with a not so serious crime. You could come in with a robbery charge or something like that, or theft or something along those lines, and have a 3 to 5 year sentence and get stabbed. That can happen. Or, I've said in other videos that medical treatment isn't good in prison. You could go to prison and get sick and not get the treatment that you needed to get better, and you could die in prison. So, that's something that I want you all to keep in mind. Now, I mentioned indeterminate sentences and determinate sentences. An indeterminate sentence is something like 25 years to life. It's not determined. So, in other words, after 25 years, you could see a parole board, and then you would have a chance to get out. But you have to serve that 25 years first. A determinate sentence would be where you have a solid number. Like, you have to do 40 years in prison. That's it. End of story. It's not 40 to life. It's not anything like that. It's you have 40 years in prison. Or life without parole. That is a determinate sentence. You don't have a set number of years that you serve, and then you have a chance of getting out. Basically, life without parole is saying you're going to live the rest of your days in prison until you die. That is life without parole. 25 years to life, 40 to life. You could serve 25 years, 40 years, and then you would see a parole board and you might get out. So, that's that. All right. So, do people usually get to their 25 years or 40 years? A lot of them do. Some of them don't, for reasons that I stated a few seconds ago or a few minutes ago. You could get stabbed. You could get sick. There's any number of reasons why someone who was in prison and sentenced to a long time wouldn't make it to the end of their sentence. However, I knew a lot of guys that will probably make it to the end of their sentence. I knew guys who were in their 30s who had hard 40s. Hard 40 means that you have to serve 40 years before you see the parole board. They had been in prison for 20 years. And so they had, 20 more years or so before they saw the parole board. Now, that would put them, let's say if they were in their 30s, that would put them before the parole board when they're in their 50s. There's a lot of guys in prison that are in their 50s. There's a lot of guys in prison that are in their 60s. There's guys in prison in wheelchairs, little old men, and they have guys who have the job of pushing them around in their chair. So it is very conceivable that a guy would go to the parole board when he was old and gray, and there's a really good chance that he could get out of prison at that point. Parole board is going to look at a guy who's old, who's not been in trouble because he's really old, and they're going to say, okay, this guy's no longer a threat to society, and they'll let him out. So there's that. You know, a lot of guys will see the parole board when they're in their 50s or 60s or something like that. And a lot of them will get out of prison. I've known a lot of them who got out of prison. So you can serve 25 years to 40 years, maybe a little bit more. But that's your indeterminate sentence. That's how that works. Life in prison for a determinate sentence could vary. You know, you could die immediately after you get to prison, or you might make it to the end. You might make it 25 years. You might make it 40 years. But just because you get to that point, you know, if you're 25 years to life, just because you get to 25 years doesn't mean they're going to let you out. If you've been a knucklehead, they'll look at you, they'll look at your history, and they'll say, no, we're going to give you a pass. That means that they're not going to let you out. They'll pass you for, let's say, 3 years. And that means that you're not going to be able to see the parole board for another 3 years. In 3 years, they'll review your case, give you another chance. And stuff like that happens quite a bit. So far, indeterminate sentences, 25 years to life. After serving 25 years, you see a parole board. 40 years to life. After 40 years, you'll see a parole board. Determinate sentences, something like life in prison without parole. You're never seeing a parole board. You're going to live out your days in prison. And if you go to prison at a young age, like 20, 25, you've got a long walk ahead of you. So there's that. Now, let's talk about, and the other determinate sentence. So let's say you got sentenced to 25 years or 40 years. That's not technically a life sentence, although it very well could be. But when you serve that time, in most states, you have to serve a certain percentage of your time. That's how they do good time. So let's say in some states, like I think Arkansas or Missouri, I'm not sure about Missouri. Anyway, you'd have to serve 50% of your time. If you behave, you get out. You know, you serve half your time and you get out. Kansas isn't like that. You have to serve 85% of your time if you're good. So, you know, if you had a 25-year sentence or a 40-year sentence or something like that, you'd serve, 85% of that if you were behaved. But that's not technically a life sentence. So let's talk about the appeals process. So anytime someone goes to prison, you have the opportunity to appeal. You might have gone to trial, you might not have, but there is something you can do to get your case back in court. Maybe there was some mix-up somewhere, maybe evidence wasn't handled properly, maybe you weren't Mirandized, maybe someone screwed up somewhere, and you have grounds to take your case back to court. I've seen a lot of people get out of prison over technicalities. That does happen. You know, the judge will screw up on the sentencing, or the prosecutor will screw something up. That happens, and guys get out. So, usually that process of getting your case back in court, though, takes a long time. We're talking about 5 to 10 years, because they'll deny an appeal or whatever you're putting through the court several times before you get to court. You're going to have to go through that process a lot. But, I mean, if you got life in prison, you got all day, so, why not? And so guys will get back to court sometimes after 5 to 10 years if they tried to. Some guys won't even bother. So there's that. But let's say they had some grounds to take it back to court. Conceivably, they could get out in 5 to 10 years. maybe a little bit after that. Sometimes what the court will do, or the prosecutor will do, they will stack charges up against a person. So I had this buddy of mine. I say he was a buddy, and that's going to reflect badly on me, but I like the guy. He robbed a bank, and he killed a couple people in the robbing of the bank. Bad thing. But I take people at, face value for what I knew them as, and he was always nice to me. Not saying he was a great person, not saying that some of the things that he did weren't bad, but he was always kind to me. And he had a life sentence, and on one case, he had a life sentence. So I think it was 25 to life, but I'm not positive. And then he had another 19-year sentence, I think, for kidnapping or robbery or something like that. Okay? And I don't know if the charges were run concurrent or consecutive. I think they were run consecutive, but basically he had two sentences running together. Not necessarily at the same time, but what that means is that if he got his life sentence overturned in court, he takes it to court, gets it overturned, he's still going to have that other 19 years to serve. Or if he did his 25 years in the 25 years to life thing, and the parole board approved him, he would parole to his next sentence. So yeah, he would get parole, but then he'd have another 19 years to serve. Kinda sucks if you're in that position, but that's what they do. So in that case, a life sentence could last a much longer time. And there are people that are in prison for 30, 40, maybe more years. There's people serving a lot of time. So that happens. I knew a guy, and I'm actually going to make some videos about him, who went into the prison system when he was 14. When I met him, I think he was like 66 or something. He was old. That's for sure. And yeah, man. Imagine going to prison when you're 14 years old and still being in prison when you're in your 60s. He ended up dying last year. So, I think he was born in 62. Something like that. No, 52. Yeah, he was born in 52. Died last year, 2019. I'm going to make some videos about him because that dude was a legend. Anyway, this concludes my video. I hope you learned something from it. I hope it was helpful, answered some questions. I'm Eric. This has been another episode of From Prison to the Streets. I'll catch you all later. Break these chains. They can't hold what can.